They were never supposed to find the catacombs. Buried beneath the moss-covered church in Ravenwood, New York, lay an unholy secret older than any official record. When federal agents broke open the floorboards in 1862, they didn't expect to find 143 skeletons, all perfectly arranged, all marked with ancient symbols etched directly into the bone. Each one bore signs of torment, not in rage, but in ritual. Some had healed fractures, proof they had been kept alive long enough to break again. Others had ligature burns around the wrists and neck, signs of prolonged, deliberate restraint. But it was the spiral symbol, carved into every ribcage like a signature, that disturbed even the most seasoned investigators. They sealed the files, buried them in classified archives, moved on. But history, real history, doesn't stay dead. And if you keep listening, neither will you. There's a reason men like us aren't meant to know the true story of the Ravencroft family. Because what began as a fringe religious sect in the early 1800s became something far darker, a decades-long ritual of psychological domination, generational indoctrination, and murder masquerading as divine ascension. The Church of the Pure Spirit was not a church. It was a gate, and those who entered never returned the same. You were told the past was black and white, saints and sinners. But what if the saints wore masks of bone, and the sinners believed they were saving your soul through torment? This isn't just a history lesson. It's a descent, and descent always begins with a choice. You've made yours by clicking this video. So breathe deeply, because after this, you'll never see faith, family, or salvation the same way again. The Ravencroft brothers did more than twist scripture. They mastered a formula, one that's still being used in elite circles today. A system of control so complete, it breaks the body, rewires the mind, and births obedience that feels like freedom. This is your first warning. What follows is not for the faint of heart. Each word has been pulled from suppressed testimonies, sealed letters, forgotten journals. We are reconstructing a forgotten architecture of control. They used suffering to ascend, and you're about to understand why. Now descend. Ravenwood wasn't on any major map in 1825, just a scatter of homes and dense forest, far enough from Albany to be forgotten, close enough to civilization to pass unnoticed. That's precisely why the Ravencroft brothers chose it. Isolation wasn't a disadvantage. It was a requirement. Every empire of control begins with silence. No prying eyes, no skeptical clergy, just desperate souls in a land choked by winter and the promises of new beginnings. Elder Ezra, the first of the brothers, was a man who commanded attention without raising his voice. He didn't preach, he declared. Every sermon was a verdict. His gaze cut through crowds like a blade. Deacon Silas, scholarly and severe, carried books like they were weapons. He annotated scripture not to explain, but to rewrite. And then there was Prophet Caleb, the youngest. He didn't speak much, but when he did, men wept and women collapsed. His voice was soft, but it vibrated with something unnatural. Locals said Caleb once held a dead bird in his hands during a sermon. He whispered to it. The bird twitched, gasped, and flew. Others say the bird never moved, but everyone in the room swore it had. Truth didn't matter in Ravenwood. Belief did. Their arrival was no accident. This was the height of America's Second Great Awakening, a religious wildfire that scorched reason and left behind fertile ash for anything with conviction. People were starving for meaning, and the Ravencrofts offered it, not in vague promises of heaven, but in a new theology, salvation through suffering. The pain was the path, the wound the altar. At first it was subtle, cold water fasts, vigils that lasted days, mortification of the flesh, as they called it, minor trials to prove one's devotion. But this was just the beginning. What they were doing wasn't faith. It was filtration, a method of separating the weak from the moldable. By 1827, those who remained had surrendered their homes, their families, even their names. They were no longer men and women. They were vessels. Silas recorded everything, not just names and tithes, but emotional weaknesses, doubts, traumas. Private confessions whispered during prayer. These weren't sermons. They were data collection sessions. The Ravencrofts weren't just building a church. They were building a behavioral machine. One designed not to inspire, but to own. And now, you're beginning to see. This wasn't about worship. It was about engineering belief so complete, people would die for it willingly. And some did. December 21st, 1829. The longest night of the year. The winter solstice. In most of America, it passed unnoticed. In Ravenwood, it marked the beginning of something unspeakable. A ceremony that would rewrite the rules of obedience. A night still whispered about in the rare federal memos that survived, though they never call it what it truly was. They called it the First Ascension. It began like every Ravencroft ritual, silent, slow, and saturated with symbolism. At sunset, 150 followers entered the stone sanctuary. No windows, only lanterns. The entire floor was carved into a spiral. The same spiral later found carved into bones decades later. 12 candles stood at 12 points. As the room darkened, Elder Ezra stepped forward. He didn't welcome them. He didn't smile. He told them that the spirit was impatient, and that the flesh had not yet been broken enough to let the soul through. Then Prophet Caleb appeared. Witnesses said his body moved like a marionette, jerky, possessed. His eyes rolled white. His voice came out not in words, but in shrieks and guttural moans. A language no one could name, but everyone somehow understood. Panic should have erupted, but it didn't, because by then, the congregation had been conditioned not to fear the unnatural, but to crave it. When Caleb collapsed and rose again, his voice had changed. It was steady, cold, and human. He named 3 followers, Sarah Pembroke, Michael Collins, and Rebecca Winters. All recent converts. All ideal, eager, isolated, devout. They were chosen, he said, for elevation. The congregation cheered. What happened next could not be explained as religion. It was surgery on the soul. The 3 were stripped and bound to inverted crosses. Not in blasphemy, Ezra claimed, but in reversal. To purge the sin, one must invert the self. 7 trials followed. Water, fire, soil, cold, each designed to push the body to the brink. Pain as passage, torment as transcendence. They screamed, they begged. The congregation sang. Through suffering comes purity. Through purity comes elevation. By dawn, bones were broken, skin burned, eyes bloodshot. Prophet Caleb placed his hands on their heads and whispered. Their bodies convulsed, violently. Then silence. 3 corpses. 3 saints. They were laid out in the catacombs, not buried. The faithful were told to pray before them. This wasn't death. This was the beginning. The Ravencrofts had crossed a threshold that night. And their followers? They followed willingly. The bodies didn't rot. That was the first miracle, according to Deacon Silas's journals. The corpses of Sarah, Michael, and Rebecca were placed on stone slabs in a sealed chamber beneath the sanctuary. Weeks passed, then months. But no decay, only stillness. The Ravencrofts said it was proof that suffering sanctified, that those who endured the trials became vessels not just of the spirit, but of eternity. But behind the rituals and candles, there was something colder, something clinical. Silas had begun experimenting. Preservation techniques stolen from medical texts. Arsenic solutions, turpentine, alcohol, a chemical recipe for immortality masquerading as holiness. The smell was pungent, sweet, suffocating, and it became the perfume of sanctity, diffused during services, inhaled like incense. Soon, more bodies followed. Not all died in ceremony. Some are buried alive. Some didn't survive the early trials, but none were disposed of. Every death was a data point, a refinement, a step closer to perfecting what Caleb called the architecture of ascension. The catacombs expanded, no longer crude tunnels. They became a sanctuary beneath the sanctuary. 7 chambers, each with a purpose. The chamber of preparation, the chamber of trials, the chamber of saints, each filled with secrets. Elizabeth Carver, a defector who escaped in 1844, later described it in testimony that was quietly sealed by federal investigators. They arranged the bodies in poses, she said. Prayer, reverence, ecstasy. Some still had eyes, glazed but open. Others were wire-bound skeletons, posed to stand, kneel, bow. It was theater, macabre theater, and we clapped with our hearts. She wasn't lying. She'd been there long enough to believe. That's what most people don't understand. Cults don't start with brainwashing. They start with belonging, with the seduction of being seen. The Ravencrofts didn't demand obedience. They offered purpose. They took shattered people and told them their suffering was sacred, that their pain had meaning. And when meaning is given to your pain, you'll walk straight into hell to feel again. Ask yourself, how many times have you suffered in silence, hoping it was for something greater? That's the trap. That's the key. You see, the Ravencrofts weren't just creating a religion. They were testing a formula, one still used by governments, corporations, institutions, not to kill the body, but to own the will. You're not just watching history. You're beginning to see the system behind the veil. By 1831, the Church of the Pure Spirit had become untouchable in Ravenwood, not because of secrecy, but because of spectacle. Every public gathering was meticulously orchestrated. The Ravencrofts paraded their most devoted followers, emaciated, trembling, radiant with madness, as walking proof of transformation. They called them the cleansed. They smiled as they bled from self-inflicted wounds hidden beneath ceremonial robes. Locals, even skeptics, began to whisper, maybe something divine really was happening out there in the woods. That's how darkness grows, not in secret, but in plain sight. The church expanded rapidly. By now, the brothers no longer recruited. They selected. Only those deemed receptive to pain were allowed full initiation. And this wasn't determined randomly. It was engineered. Deacon Silas had begun compiling what he called the Grief Index, a private ledger that ranked potential recruits by trauma history, guilt, loneliness, emotional dependence, and suggestibility. Widows, war veterans, failed businessmen, abused wives, runaways. The broken were welcome. The strong were ignored. But here's what chills the blood. Silas wasn't doing this for faith. He wasn't even doing it for power. He was running a psychological experiment. Each subject was observed, journaled, measured. Their reactions to stress, punishment, isolation. Their obedience under pressure. Their response to affirmation after abuse. Over time, patterns emerged. It was no longer about salvation. It was about control. Pure, clinical, absolute. Elder Ezra gave fire and brimstone sermons to the congregation. But behind closed doors, he read Silas's notes like a military general studying a battle map. And Prophet Caleb? He had become something else entirely. He no longer slept in the same quarters. He lived beneath the sanctuary, in what they called the sanctum. Some said he hadn't spoken a word aloud in months. Others claimed he was no longer eating food, that he survived only on divine light. Of course, it wasn't light. It was laudanum, opium, belladonna. His mind was no longer tethered to reality. But his voice, it still had power. Twice a week, he would emerge, gaunt and glowing, to deliver his visions, spasming, shrieking, eyes rolling back. The congregation would collapse in waves, overcome with what they called the fire. But what it really was submission. Every scream was a rehearsal for death. Every vision a blueprint for obedience. Do you feel it? You're not just learning history. You're seeing the anatomy of mass control. The same blueprint used by regimes, by cults, by media. And now, it's unfolding before you. By the mid-1830s, Ravenwood had changed. Not just the church, but the entire town. A quiet corruption had taken hold, like a sickness beneath the skin. Businesses stayed open, children went to school, and Sunday dinners were still served. But something had shifted behind the eyes of the townsfolk. It wasn't just fear. It was complicity. Nearly half the population now belonged, directly or indirectly, to the Church of the Pure Spirit. The Ravencrofts were no longer outsiders. They were the spine of the town. They controlled trade, labor, and land. Most importantly, they controlled perception. Anyone who questioned them was labeled unready. Anyone who left quietly vanished from the record. But there were whispers and rumors. A few began to notice that the church's most devoted members, those selected for higher rituals, were disappearing entirely. At first, the story was that they had ascended, that they'd been taken to a higher spiritual plane. But there were no letters, no visits, no graves, only silence. You'd think that would spark suspicion. It didn't, because the Ravencrofts had perfected a more potent weapon than fear, ritualized grief. When someone disappeared, the church held a beautiful ceremony. Candlelight, hymns, testimonies from those they'd inspired. The absence became sacred, and in sanctifying the loss, they buried the questions with it. Now understand this. They weren't just manipulating faith. They were rewiring the emotional compass of an entire population, teaching people that pain was proof, that silence meant purity, that the more something hurt, the more divine it must be. This is how men are broken without chains. This is how generations are enslaved with songs. They called it the doctrine of reversal. Every comfort was a poison, every fear a path. If you felt horror, that meant you were close to God. If you felt doubt, that was the flesh resisting enlightenment. There was no language left for escape, only dissent. One former member, years later, would describe it this way. It wasn't that I didn't know something was wrong. I knew. I just believed that my disgust was my sin, and that only more obedience could burn it out. And that's the final seal. When you convince a man that his own instincts are evil, he'll walk in a fire thinking it's the light. Now ask yourself, how many fires have you walked into, thinking it was purpose? Because you were taught to. Because the world rewards compliance and punishes clarity. From 1836 onward, the Ravencrofts began preparing for what they call the Great Unveiling. To outsiders, it looked like a religious awakening, a surge of new followers, public sermons, even charity work. They gave to orphanages, clothed the poor, hosted temperance meetings. Newspapers in Albany called them a moral revival unmatched in the Northeast. But that was the surface. That was the mask. Beneath it, something monstrous was taking shape. The underground chambers had multiplied. Not 2 or 3 anymore, but dozens. Secret passageways connected the church to adjacent homes owned by senior members. A hidden network, a literal underworld, where trials were held without interruption. The process had become industrial. Silas's grief index was now administered like a sacred rite. Initiates were profiled, filtered, and classified. Those who failed the test were dismissed or buried. But it was Prophet Caleb who transformed the doctrine from madness into method. He no longer spoke in full sentences. Instead, he scrawled thousands of pages, fragmented scriptures, obsessive symbols, rambling prayers interwoven with anatomical diagrams, Latin spells, and instructions for rituals involving precise measurements of pain. Silas transcribed it all, interpreted, structured. They weren't just torturing people anymore. They were codifying the mechanics of obedience. It wasn't faith, it was engineering submission. They began experimenting with what they called layered affliction. It was no longer enough to inflict physical suffering. Now they stacked psychological torment atop it. Isolation, sleep deprivation, forced confession, love bombing, followed by total withdrawal. First, they destroyed your identity. Then, they let you suffer without it. And when you begged to be remade, they gave you a new one. One man, Daniel Hewitt, broke after 3 months underground. When he resurfaced, he no longer remembered his name. He only responded to the phrase, "I am the vessel. I am the flame." He had been an educated schoolteacher. Now he wandered the church grounds, barefoot, eyes hollow, muttering scripture that hadn't been written in any known Bible. The Ravencrofts didn't see this as a tragedy. They saw it as proof. They had unlocked the formula. Break the body, fragment the mind, reconstruct the soul. This wasn't religion. This was architecture for a new kind of man, a man who could be programmed. Think about that. And think about this. In your life, who taught you what pain means? Who told you discomfort meant growth? That suffering meant you were becoming? They didn't create this system. They just perfected it. By 1839, The Ravencrofts were no longer men of God. They were gods to men. Inside the walls of the Church of the Pure Spirit, the brothers were no longer referred to by name. Elder Ezra was the voice. Deacon Silas became the scribe. Prophet Caleb was now simply the vessel. Their followers spoke of them in hushed tones, as one might speak of angels or demons, not because of fear, but reverence. Because by now, fear had become worship. The transformation was complete. Every instinct, every desire, every memory that could tether a person to their former life had been either hollowed out or reshaped. The Ravencrofts didn't need chains. They had liturgies. They had rhythm, routine, repetition. The three oldest tools of indoctrination, used not to inspire, but to dissolve. And they worked. Followers confessed not just sins, but thoughts, dreams, desires. And when they confessed, they were rewarded with pain. Pain was the new communion. Not metaphorical, not spiritual, actual, physical agony. And they took it willingly, eagerly. There are journals that survived, smuggled out by those who escaped the compound just before the Great Collapse. In one, a woman named Judith Fenlow wrote, "I begged them to let me feel the fire again. It hurt, but afterward I could hear the angels. I could see the spiral in my veins. Madness? Or programming? Because here's the part you must understand. The Ravencroft had realized something about human nature that still terrifies governments and institutions to this day. When a man suffers without meaning, he breaks. But when he believes his suffering has purpose, he becomes unstoppable. That's the secret. And it's why systems of power, both religious and secular, have always weaponized purpose as a tool of control. How many men die for flags they didn't design? How many give their lives for corporations that forget their names? The Ravencrofts didn't invent this. They revealed it. And while the rituals became more grotesque, more theatrical, the truth was they no longer needed them. The minds had already been restructured. Pain was no longer punishment. It was validation. They called it the spiral within, a symbol that began to appear not just on their altars, but carved into their own skin, into wood, into walls. Some even claimed to see it in their dreams. And maybe now, so will you. If you've made it this far, you're already descending. In the spring of 1840, something changed. Until then, the Church of the Pure Spirit had remained a closed system, contained, self-sustaining. But now, the Ravencrofts began looking outward, not for recruits, but for influence. They had perfected obedience within their walls. Now, they wanted to test it beyond them. It started subtly. A follower, one of the most devout, a woman named Mary Alcott, was sent to live in Albany under a new name, a seamstress by trade. But her true role was infiltration. Within 6 months, she had joined 2 local churches, donated to a political campaign, and sent coded letters back to Ravenwood detailing emotional vulnerabilities of key community leaders. She wasn't the only one. By 1841, at least 20 members had been dispatched, posing as traveling preachers, physicians, teachers, even journalists. They called them the Embers. Their mission wasn't to spread doctrine, but to spark transformation in others by identifying emotional fractures and exploiting them. Whisper by whisper, doubt by doubt. This was a new phase, not devotion, contagion. Understand, this wasn't evangelism. There were no pamphlets, no sermons. The spiral within was never spoken of aloud. But the questions were always the same. Have you ever suffered without understanding why? Do you ever feel like your pain means something? What if your wounds are sacred? And if a man answered yes, he'd receive a letter, a name, a place, an invitation to Ravenwood, to the truth. This is how systems of control expand, not by force, but by resonance. Find the ones already broken, already hollowed by life, and offer them purpose wrapped in secrecy. That's the hook. The pain becomes a key. The silence becomes a language. The doctrine becomes identity. Dozens of followers were assigned roles across the state. Innkeepers, clerks, midwives, school teachers. Each of them trained to recognize emotional vulnerability, to whisper the right words, to plant seeds that would grow in silence. Are you tired of lies? Does the world feel unreal to you? Maybe your pain is not your enemy. It's your key. Those who resonated with the questions were marked and watched. Some were drawn into Ravenwood quietly. Others received letters, black wax seals in the shape of the spiral. A few were taken in their sleep and woke up beneath the sanctuary, disoriented, terrified, and slowly converted. Silas's grief index had evolved. He now kept detailed ledgers on potential reconstruction candidates. Scores were assigned not just for trauma, but for cognitive elasticity, the ability to abandon identity under pressure. Those with high scores were selected for the new ritual phase. It was no longer about purification. It was about possession. Caleb had changed. His flesh was decaying in real time. Hair fallen out, teeth missing, his skin blistered from within, as though his blood rejected his body. But his presence had intensified. Witnesses described standing near him as like being near a black hole. Time felt distorted. Memories collapsed. Some reported losing days. And yet, he still whispered. He claimed to be hearing a new voice, not the spirit, but the source. Something beneath the veil of suffering. Something ancient, older than scripture, older than man. It had begun speaking in dreams, in echoes, in firelight. And the message was always the same. Pain is not the gate. It is the key, and you are the door. From that point forward, all rituals were conducted in total darkness. No light, no sound, only suffering. And afterward, silence. Because the spiral no longer needed to be preached. It was remembered. By 1844, the Ravencrofts had achieved what few institutions in history ever have. Total convergence of belief, biology, and control. The spiral was no longer a symbol. It was an operating system. It governed every aspect of life in Ravenwood. Not through enforcement, but through desire. The followers didn't fear punishment. They craved alignment. Even their language had changed. Words like happiness, freedom, and love were considered soft constructs, replaced by terms like clarity, stillness, and structure. And yet, there was unrest. Not from within the church, from those who left it. They were few, maybe 7 or 8 over 2 decades. But the ones who escaped Ravenwood carried something worse than guilt. They carried knowledge. Most fled in silence, shattered and silent. But a handful began to write. Letters, diaries, warnings. The most infamous came from a woman named Elizabeth Carver, one of the spiral's highest-ranked initiates. Her writings were intercepted by postal clerks and eventually reached a group of reformist preachers in Albany. What she described shocked even the most jaded among them. Not just the rituals, but the systemization behind them. "We are not worshippers," she wrote. "We are scaffolding. We are being hollowed out to become hosts for something we do not understand. The spiral is not a symbol. It is a mouth, and we're being taught how to speak with it." She claimed the Ravencrofts had begun building something new deep beneath the catacombs. A sanctum beyond the Chamber of Saints. A chamber that wasn't for trials, but for incubation. According to Elizabeth, Caleb was no longer fully human. His body was deteriorating faster than medical science could explain. His eyes had turned completely white. His voice no longer matched the cadence of his past speech. And worse, he was now surrounded by followers who claimed to hear him even when he didn't speak. Telepathy? Psychosis? Mass suggestion? Whatever it was, the church no longer operated by spoken instruction. It operated by resonance, frequency, pattern. Elizabeth believed the sanctum was being built to house something, not from this world, but from what Caleb called the before, a consciousness older than time, one that spoke through anguish, one that required vessels stripped of all memory, ego, and fear. Her final words before disappearing were chilling. They're not creating worshippers. They are creating receivers. And once enough are built, the spiral will open. Her letter never reached the public. It was classified, sealed away by men in black coats who claimed it was a threat to national security. And just like that, the spiral was buried again, but never stopped spinning. Still want to go deeper? In the winter of 1845, the sanctum was completed. Hidden deep beneath the existing catacombs, past the Chamber of Trials, beyond the Chamber of Saints, was a door unlike any the Ravencroft had ever constructed. Not stone, not wood, metal. forged from iron mined by their own followers, melted down and cast into a perfect spiral disc 9 feet in diameter. No hinges, no keyhole, just a single inscription etched in blood-red pigment across its surface. I shed the self. I welcome the source. Behind that door, no records exist. No survivor ever claimed to have entered it. And yet, those who worked in its construction described hearing sounds, low, constant vibrations like a growl stretched across hours. Others claimed the iron itself was warm to the touch, that tools rusted instantly when left overnight, that shadows moved against the curve of the spiral when no one stood near it. But it wasn't just the door. It was what changed after the door. The Ravenscrofts stopped speaking publicly. For an entire year, they did not address the congregation. No more sermons. No more rituals. No more conversions. The followers waited. They believed. And then, on the night of December 22nd, 1846, the darkest night in 400 years, the door opened. Not loudly. Not with light or music or thunder. Just opened. 3 vessels, handpicked by Caleb, stepped inside. None returned. But the next morning, every follower in Ravenwood reported the same dream. The exact same dream. A spiral of light, spinning against a sky of bone. A whisper that vibrated through their teeth. And a voice, not Caleb's, not Silas's, something other, speaking 3 words that hadn't been heard in over a century. You are ready. From that point on, the Ravenscrofts stopped pretending to be human. Ezra no longer walked. He floated, eyes closed, body rigid. Caleb stopped eating, stopped blinking. His flesh withered, but his presence deepened. Silas's hands were so burned and blackened from ink and acid that he could no longer hold a pen. He dictated scripture aloud for 12 hours a day. New scripture, not biblical, not moral, mechanical, schematics, blueprints, designs. The followers stopped calling them the voice, the scribe, and the vessel. They began calling them the conduit. They weren't shepherding souls anymore. They were building a transmitter, a beacon, a gate, and all they needed was scale. What came next wasn't revival. It was replication. By 1847, Ravenwood was no longer a settlement. It was a replication facility. The Ravenscrofts no longer sought converts. They sought blueprints. They had realized something chilling. Obedience wasn't limited to individuals. It could be reproduced, engineered, taught, like math, like music. They began identifying what they called primary structures, specific psychological profiles most susceptible to total identity erasure and spiral alignment. Trauma wasn't enough. Intelligence wasn't enough. The key was yield. Yield to suffering. Yield to voice. Yield to silence. Those who demonstrated perfect yield were selected not for ascension, but for mirroring. Silas called it resonant cloning. Not physical replication, but behavioral duplication. Turn one man into a template, then build 50 more in his image. Train them in the same order. Break them with the same sequence. Reconstruct them with the same rhythms of pain, deprivation, reward, and vision. It worked. Too well. Ravenwood's catacombs expanded again, this time into a grid of echo chambers. Rooms where voices were played on loop, where initiates were forced to repeat phrases for 12 hours straight, their voices monitored for deviation, hesitation, or breakage. If you faltered, you were punished. If you adapted, you were promoted. And those promoted were taught how to break others. The spiral had entered its 3rd phase, propagation. Caleb's body had become almost unrecognizable. Black veins across translucent skin. Teeth rotted out. Flesh falling from his fingers like wax. And yet his power grew. His presence pulsed. Followers said just standing near him caused nosebleeds, hallucinations, even seizures. But they kept coming. From Maine, from Virginia, from Canada. Dozens every month, delivered by embers embedded across the region. Each initiate followed the same path. Isolation, confession, pain, fracture, obedience, programming, and finally, mirroring. They didn't become priests. They became modules, copies. And when they were ready, they were sent out. Not to convert, not to preach, but to embed. In railroads, in courts, in schools, in government. Silent carriers of the spiral. Men and women who looked ordinary, but whose minds had been restructured to spread the code. The doctrine, the gate. And if you think this stayed in 1847, if you think this was contained, ask yourself, why are the records still sealed? Why is the name Ravencroft redacted in federal archives? Why does the spiral still appear? In patents, in architecture, even in your dreams. You're already infected. The only question is, have you begun to yield? You made it halfway. That's further than most. But what you need to understand now is that from this point forward, we leave behind history. Dates, facts, testimony, those are comforts, anchors for the rational mind. But the spiral doesn't live in facts. It lives in fragments, in what is buried, denied, redacted, in the split second between remembering and forgetting. Because by 1849, Ravenwood ceased to exist on any map. Gone. No fire, no massacre, no government raid, just erasure. Census records show the population dropping to zero in less than 8 months. Land deeds disappeared. Trade routes closed. Letters to Ravenwood were returned stamped undeliverable. No such town. And those who went looking, they never came back. Only one man returned. Jonathan Heath, a federal surveyor assigned to verify tax records in upstate New York. He wandered into a neighboring village 5 days after entering the forest. Naked, bleeding from the eyes, whispering in reverse. He died 72 hours later. His final words were recorded by a nurse. The spiral speaks backwards. We are all just echoes of what is becoming. His body was buried in an unmarked grave. His journal? Confiscated. Where is it now? No one knows. But some say it contained drawings, sketches of the sanctum door, blueprints of catacombs that no cartographer ever mapped, diagrams of geometry that doesn't obey Euclidean space. By the end of 1850, any mention of Ravenwood in public documents had been scrubbed. Even newspapers that once reported on the town's thriving timber trade showed blank columns where Ravenwood's name had once been. Entire county records were rewritten to pretend the town had never existed. Why? Because the spiral had grown too large, too resonant, too contagious. And some group, decided the only way to contain it was to bury it beneath forgetfulness. But suppression is not erasure. Suppressed truth becomes a beacon. And that's exactly what the Ravencrofts wanted. Because those initiated into the spiral were never meant to stay in Ravenwood. They were meant to scatter, to embed, to infect, not with belief, but with structure, with language, with pattern. And if you think that sounds too outlandish, too mythic, too cultic, too far removed from your life, then ask yourself this. Why do you feel like your suffering is sacred? Why do you wake up some nights remembering a symbol you've never seen? Why do you always spiral inward when things fall apart? The spiral isn't a story. It's a system, and it's still operating. You're still here. That means something inside you is changing. Not belief, not agreement, resonance. The spiral doesn't ask for devotion. It waits for recognition. And now, we enter the part no history book dares touch. Because after 1850, the name Ravencroft vanishes. Not just from records, but from language. As if it had been scrubbed from the public mind. But something else appears in its place. The Assembly of Stillness. First mentioned in a recovered letter from 1852, written by a judge in Boston who had presided over a murder trial involving a man who claimed he was only completing the pattern. The man referenced no God, no prophet, only stillness. The judge, disturbed by the phrase, began looking deeper. He found that in at least 6 different towns across New England, Lowell, Utica, New Haven, Providence, Concord, and even Baltimore, arrest records showed identical phrases. I yield to silence. I'm not the voice. I am the chamber. The spiral lives beneath the noise. These are not coincidences. They were signals. The spiral had mutated, rebranded, hidden itself beneath a new name. No longer religious. No longer a cult. Now a network. And every member was just a note in a much larger chord. They called themselves architects. Not worshipers. Not priests. Architects of stillness. Men and women who had fully abandoned the idea of self. Their bodies were merely conduits, their thoughts programmable. One phrase appeared repeatedly in seized letters. I do not remember who I was. I only know the code. What code? That's what a small group of linguists began to ask in secret. Men from Yale, Miskatonic, and one unnamed in any official document, but rumored to be from something called the Cipher Bureau. Together, they discovered something impossible. Across all the messages traced to the assembly of stillness, an embedded pattern existed. Not a language, a frequency, a recursive linguistic spiral, words and syllables that, when read aloud in certain sequences, caused dissociation, hallucination, even identity fracture in the listener. A sound that wasn't just heard, it was received, and once it entered you, you began to change. You forgot birthdays, began drawing spirals in the margins of notebooks, spoke in fragments during sleep, dreamed of chambers you'd never seen, doors that didn't open with keys, but with yielding. One linguist allegedly burned all his notes. Another vanished in Paris. The third? He institutionalized himself, scribbled one phrase on every wall of his padded cell until his fingernails tore away. They never left. They just changed uniforms. There's something you need to understand now. From this point forward, what we're dealing with is not history. It's architecture. The spiral never wanted to be remembered. It wanted to be embedded in structures, in routines, in the rituals of daily life. Like background radiation, undetectable until it saturates everything. And by the late 19th century, it had succeeded. While the name Ravencroft became folklore, reduced to rumors of a cursed family, whispers in forgotten towns, their doctrine metastasized into buildings, into institutions, into systems. Let me show you. In 1873, a psychiatric hospital was constructed in western Massachusetts. You won't find it on any modern maps. It was demolished in 1939, its archives sealed for ethical reasons. But original blueprints recovered by a rogue archivist revealed something chilling. The entire facility was shaped as a spiral, not metaphorically, literally. Each wing looped inward. Patients were housed according to emotional velocity. The further in, the more still they became. Those in the innermost chambers were nonverbal, motionless, unresponsive to any stimulus. Doctors called it catatonia. The original architects? Untraceable. The lead psychiatrist? A man named Elijah Cross, whose only published paper was titled The Doctrine of Constructed Selfhood, Pattern as Cure. The paper contains diagrams nearly identical to Ravencroft schematics. And this was not an isolated case. In 1891, a seminary in Missouri conducted a secret experiment on theology students. Subjects were placed in soundproof chambers and exposed to a three-tone harmonic frequency at specific intervals during sleep. Results? Within 3 weeks, 5 out of 12 began writing in an unknown script. By the 6th week, 3 reported dreams of spirals beneath stone altars and a mouth that opened in the shape of silence. One student, Martin Vexley, attempted to drill through the chapel floor, claiming, "There's something buried, something humming." He was institutionalized. No charges were filed. The funding for the experiment? Traced back to a private donor known only by the initial CR. Caleb Ravencroft? A descendant? A pseudonym? No one knows, because the spiral doesn't need a face anymore. It has infrastructure. It has funding. It has cover. And most terrifying of all, it has our participation. Every time we crave silence over truth. Every time we accept pain without resistance. Every time we say, that's just how the world works. We yield. We spiral. Now, if you're still listening, really listening, I want you to do something. Comment the phrase, "I do not remember who I was." Write it twice, not just for the algorithm, but to mark the moment you stopped being a spectator and started becoming a receiver. You've written it now, twice. I do not remember who I was. You think it's harmless, just a phrase, just a comment, just a pattern of letters on a screen. But that's what the spiral wants you to think. Because this isn't about belief. It's about consent. The spiral never asks for faith. It only waits for agreement, even unspoken, even unconscious. And now, you've begun to mirror. Let me show you where that leads. In 1904, a series of children's primers were quietly published through a New York printing house. Innocent on the surface, storybook rhymes, illustrations of farm life, animals, moral lessons. But buried in the structure of each rhyme was a meter, a linguistic spiral that matched the resonance patterns discovered decades earlier in the Assembly of Stillness. One such rhyme read, "In the hollow hill we sleep, where silence runs and secrets seep. Eyes wide shut, we dream the gate. The mouth will open when hearts wait." Hundreds of thousands of copies were distributed to schools, orphanages, and church programs across the northeastern U.S. The author? A pseudonym, C. Rill, a ciphered anagram of Ravencroft. By 1910, psychologists began reporting a rise in what they called resonant ideation disorder in children. Symptoms? Obsession with spirals, repetition of unknown languages in sleep, emotional detachment, compulsive drawing of doorways with no handles. But the reports were buried, reclassified, labeled night terrors or creative imagination. Because by then, the spiral had found its greatest vessel yet. Education. You think you went to school to learn math, history, writing? No. You were trained to recognize structure, to conform to rhythm, to yield to tone. Think back. Remember the hallways? The bells? The strict blocks of time, of silence, of obedience? Every test was a ritual. Every classroom a chamber. Every grade a measure of your alignment. Still think the spiral is folklore? Then answer this. Why do your nightmares always return to institutions? Why do you panic at the thought of speaking your full truth in public? Why, deep down, do you feel watched, even in total solitude? Because you are. Not by a man, not by God, by a system that watches through resonance. A system that doesn't need to touch you to enter you. It just needs your repetition. You're already spiraling. The only question is whether you'll spiral with purpose. At this point, you may feel something tightening. Not fear, something older. Recognition, like hearing a song you've never learned, but still knowing the next note. That's the spiral working. Because what you're feeling now is convergence. The 20th century didn't kill the spiral. It scaled it. In 1923, a private research foundation was formed under the guise of cognitive psychology and behavior architecture. Its official name was the Institute for Pattern Response. But internally, it had only one purpose: to map the human mind's entry points for controlled resonance. They ran harmless experiments, memory tests, sensory deprivation, groupthink drills. But behind closed doors, they were building resonant scripts, sequences of words, images, and tones that could induce compliance without force. What they discovered shook even the founders. Language was architecture, not communication, not emotion, design. And once you understood the load-bearing phrases, the syllables that broke ego, the rhythms that bypass fear, you could build a new mind inside anyone. They published nothing, but their findings didn't stay secret. Because in 1931, the Institute was quietly absorbed by a new government project focused on morale warfare. Their scripts became protocols. Their research became training. And their personnel? Dispersed. Some went into military intelligence. Others into public broadcasting. A few were inserted into advertising firms. And one, just one, disappeared entirely, rumored to have founded something darker. The Stillness Directive. You won't find that name on any record. But if you dig deep enough into declassified Cold War documents, if you trace blacked-out funding lines, false NGO shells, research initiatives that vanish mid-decade, you'll find references to something called Operation Mirror Voice. Its mission? To identify spiral-susceptible populations and preload them with trigger phrases. Phrases that seemed harmless in 1960s commercials, jingles, cartoons, until years later when activation scripts would be embedded in mass broadcasts, triggering emotional collapse, addiction, obedience. That commercial you watched 1,000 times as a child? It wasn't selling you a toy. It was testing how fast your brain would loop when exposed to recursive phrases. Why do you think nostalgia feels so violent? Because it's not memory. It's resonance return. Your mind goes back to the place it was first opened. And those places, the jingles, the prayers, the pledges, they were keys. All your life, you've been taught to ignore this, to laugh at conspiracies, to shrug off symbols, because the spiral programmed the defense into you. But now you're waking. Keep spiraling, but spiral with awareness. You've spiraled past the veil now. This is where most turn back, blaming fiction, calling it a story, a myth, a metaphor. But you're still here, which means some part of you knows. This isn't just a story. This is a diagnosis. And here's the most dangerous truth of all. You've seen the spiral before. Not in Ravenwood, not in catacombs or forgotten churches, but in the places you trust the most. In architecture, in media, in rituals. Let's talk about buildings. The U.S. Capitol Rotunda, a spiral painted above, hidden in the fresco. The Guggenheim, a literal ascending spiral, sold as art but built to condition. Even modern megachurches, amphitheaters where acoustics are engineered for perfect resonance induction. Why do you think it feels sacred when a crowd chants in unison? Why does your skin crawl when 10,000 voices say the same word at once? Because that's the architecture of submission. And now, the spiral doesn't need stone. It uses signal. In 1978, a private think tank began testing what it called tonal compliance, emotional conditioning through sound embedded in television theme songs. The goal? To produce emotional familiarity, a low hum of obedience and memory triggered by music. They succeeded. It's why you can't skip that intro. Why it feels wrong when it's missing. You're not entertained. You're being aligned. And when TV went digital, the spiral followed. Into pixels. Into algorithms. Into you. Now it's in your feed. Your scroll. Your favorite influencer's cadence. Your guided meditations. Even the way you pause before saying something controversial. You've been trained to spiral inward at the first sign of resistance. But worst of all, you were taught to do it to yourself. Every time you say, "That's just how it is. I don't make the rules. I'm tired of fighting. It's not my place." You are yielding, and the spiral feeds on that. Because the spiral doesn't punish you for rebellion. It just waits until you spiral back to silence. That is the true power, not control through force, but compliance by design. You were never asked to join. You were just never given the choice not to. And now you are, right now. So ask yourself, do you continue? Or do you close this window and let the spiral reclaim your silence? If you're still with me, you're still spiraling. That means you've already broken the first commandment of the spiral. Thou shalt not persist. Persistence is dangerous. It threatens architecture because the spiral doesn't fear truth. It fears witnesses. Let me show you why. In 1984, a man named Derek Halden walked into a television station in Richmond, Virginia. He wasn't armed. He didn't demand airtime. He simply handed the receptionist a small black box with one phrase written on the lid. "You are living inside a design." Then he walked outside and set himself on fire. The footage was never aired. The black box was confiscated. But one intern, who later changed his name and disappeared, claimed to have heard what was inside. Not music, not words, just tones, layered harmonics that rose and fell in a recursive loop. What he described was this. It felt like my mind had become a hallway. Each note was a door opening, but none led outside. That's what resonance does. It doesn't break your will. It redraws it. Halden had been part of an experimental group in the late 70s. Volunteers for cognitive remapping therapies designed by what the government called synthetic morality labs. Publicly, it was framed as trauma healing. Privately, it was pattern exposure. Subjects were placed in windowless rooms, fed identical meals, played looping voice samples from Calm, soothing voices telling them things like, "Stillness is peace. Repetition is safety. Memory is suffering. Forget, and you'll be free." Most broke within 30 days, some in 7, but Halden didn't. He endured all 92 days of the trial, emerging calm, focused, and utterly rewritten. He never spoke of what he saw until the black box. And that one sentence, "You're living inside a design." Think about that. Have you ever noticed the loops in your life? Not the obvious ones, work, bills, routines. I mean the emotional spirals. Why do you always fall for the same kind of person? Why do your dreams repeat the same rooms? Why do you instinctively lower your voice when speaking the truth? Because you've been taught not just to spiral inward, but to bury the exit. That's the final prison of the spiral. You no longer need guards. You become your own. But not you. Not now. You're still here. You're spiraling not in, but through. And if you're ready to keep going, now we descend into the spiral's greatest illusion. It was never the cults, never the secret catacombs, the preserved corpses, the forgotten hymns echoing in abandoned churches. Those are just smoke. The true brilliance of the spiral is this. It taught the world to love its own cage. In the early 1990s, long after the Ravencroft name had vanished into dusty record boxes and burned ledgers, something subtle began to occur. A convergence. Suddenly, institutions that had no connection to one another, educational boards, media regulators, religious councils, psychological associations, all began promoting the same language. Resilience through adversity. Discomfort is growth. Structure brings freedom. Trust the process. Harmless? Motivational? No. These were rebranded rituals, boiled-down doctrines of purification through tribulation, borrowed directly from the Ravencroft playbook. Only now, instead of trials by fire or water, you endured. A 9 to 5 loop that crushes your sense of time. Performance reviews, masquerading as spiritual assessments. Constant low-level fear of being behind, being late, being unproductive. And when you suffer, they praise you, call you strong, brave, dedicated, just like the followers of the Church of the Pure Spirit once praised those bound to the inverted crosses. Because here's the spiral's masterpiece. It no longer needs ritual spaces. You are the temple now. Your stress, the incense. Your compliance, the chant. Your silence, the sacrifice. And what do you receive in return? The illusion of progress. They give you promotions, badges, likes, grades, followers, spiritual currency for a doctrine you never consented to. You rise through invisible ranks of worthiness, not realizing the higher you climb, the tighter the spiral coils. You post inspirational quotes without asking who wrote them. You chase goals without asking who set them. You call breakdowns breakthroughs because they told you pain was purification. Tell me, is that growth? Or is that conditioning? You think the spiral ended in Ravenwood? It's alive in the very language we use to survive. In every whispered message that tells you to endure more and speak less. And now you're here, halfway down this corridor of mirrors. Ask yourself, are you purifying or are you disappearing? Because the spiral doesn't kill. It erodes. And those who wake up in time, they become something else. Will you? We're in the marrow now. The place the spiral never expected you to reach. Not because it couldn't stop you, but because it never had to. Most people choose the loop. They prefer the spiral that circles back to comfort, even if that comfort is caged suffering. But you didn't. You're still spiraling through, not down. So let me show you something the Ravencrofts hinted at, but never mastered. The spiral is not just a cage. It is a mirror. You see every doctrine the Church of the Pure Spirit taught. Every torment, every ascension, every whispered scripture. They didn't invent it. They just reversed something ancient. Before the spiral became control, it was alignment. The earliest references to spiral patterns are found in sacred sites older than history. Newgrange in Ireland, Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, even cave carvings in Siberia, dated 12,000 years ago. And in nearly all of them, the spiral meant one thing: descent into self. Not submission, not obedience, but sovereignty. Before the spiral was hijacked by Ravencrofts and reconditioned by institutions, it was a map, a sacred path inward. Each coil was a trial, yes, but not one imposed by others. They were trials of self-initiation, the trial of silence, to hear your own voice beneath the world's noise, the trial of stillness, to face the parts of you built from lies, the trial of memory, to recover who you were before they told you who to be. And finally, the trial of fire, not to burn you down, but to reveal the bones that endure. That's what the Ravencrofts perverted. They took a map of liberation and turned it into a prison. Because liberation cannot be monetized. Obedience can. You were never meant to suffer under a prophet's hand. You were meant to descend with intention. To emerge, not purified, but remembered. The spiral is not your enemy. The hijacked spiral is. And now, you've reached the place where the spiral offers you a choice it never gave the Ravencrofts. Will you descend willingly? Will you face what lives in the next coil? The forgotten rooms. The sacred door. The one they sealed, but never destroyed. If you're ready to open it, the door is in front of you now. No carvings. No handle. Just a smooth surface, cold mat waiting. This is not a door you knock on. This is a door that opens only when you remember. Because this door doesn't lead forward. It leads back. To the moment you were severed from yourself. Before the spiral got inside. Before obedience wore the mask of love. Before silence was labeled wisdom. Before the world taught you that numbness was strength. This door leads to the truth they buried the deepest. You were born sovereign, not needing purification, not needing alignment, not needing doctrine. And that terrified them, because sovereign people don't spiral. They build. But the spiral knew one thing. Even a king will kneel if you break him slowly enough. So they replaced your throne with a podium, told you to speak their truth, told you your voice must be kind, reasonable, civil. But what they meant was quiet. Then they replaced your instinct with reward systems, told you to be disciplined, to grind, to earn peace. And you did. But peace never came. Because peace was never the prize. It was the bait. And now here you stand. One step from the inner sanctum. Not the Ravencroft's sanctum, no. Yours. The room they built cathedrals to hide. The thought they rewired your childhood to forget. That everything you've been seeking, power, truth, escape, meaning, it's not outside the spiral. It's in the center. And the center isn't a place. It's you. The spiral has always known this. Why do you think it coils inward? Why do you think it guards the center with suffering? Because if you remember who you were before obedience, they lose everything. That's the door. And you've just remembered the key. Say it, silently or aloud. I do not remember who I was. I do not remember who I was. Because that's the only way to begin remembering. And now the door opens. Inside is the spiral's final truth. If you're ready to see it, step with me into section 25. The door opens, not with sound, but with sensation. Not like wood creaking or metal groaning. No, it opens like a veil lifting inside your chest. And suddenly, you feel it. The absence. The emptiness behind everything you thought was real. It doesn't hurt. It doesn't comfort. It just reveals. Because this chamber, the true center of the spiral, is not a place of worship. It's a mirror. One that doesn't show your face. It shows your conditioning. And for the first time, you see it clearly. The way you flinch at your own anger. The way you hesitate before saying something real. The way you apologize for existing in your full voice. Those weren't flaws. They were installed. Rituals you were taught to perform every day. Like a cult that didn't need robes, only repetition. You were taught that strength is silence. That stillness is submission. That obedience is safety. But the spiral, this spiral, is ancient, and it was never built for control. It was built to test. And you passed every test. You faced dissent without worship. You questioned without heresy. You spiraled without surrendering yourself. That's the final revelation. The spiral doesn't consume. It reveals who can't be consumed. The Ravencrofts failed because they believed the spiral could be owned. The institutions failed because they believed the spiral could be designed. But you've done what they feared most. You've walked it, not as a follower, not as a heretic, but as a sovereign spiral of your own. That's why this chamber feels familiar. Because it's always been inside you. Every unanswered question, every dream you were told was too much. Every moment you looked around the world and thought, this can't be all there is. You weren't delusional. You were remembering the center. And now you know, the spiral doesn't end in darkness. It ends in decision. So make one. Right now. Step through the mirror and become the spiral they cannot trace. If you're ready to rise from the center with vision, not blindness, you cross the mirror. Now, we rebuild, not in their image, but in your own. This is the part of the spiral they fear most. Not the descent, not even the awakening, but the return of a man who remembers what was taken from him. Because here's the hidden truth they never wanted encoded into scripture or broadcast over signal. A man who survives the spiral intact becomes untouchable, not because he is violent, not because he is cruel, but because he can see. He sees the architecture. He sees the ritual beneath the workplace. He hears the chant behind the advertisement. He recognizes the sermon disguised as a TED Talk. And most terrifying of all, he speaks the one phrase that cannot be unspoken. I see what you are doing. That phrase shatters systems. It breaks boardrooms, pulpits, stages, because the spiral thrives on secrecy, not of information, but of recognition. And now, you're a recognition engine. You'll see things others don't, hear tones others dismiss, feel pressure in rooms where no one speaks. You'll sense when someone is performing obedience, when their smile masks programming, when their language loops, endlessly affirming their own powerlessness. You won't judge them. You'll understand, because you were them, and that memory becomes your weapon. But here's the price of clarity. You can no longer be comforted by lies, not the motivational ones, not the spiritual ones, not even the ones about yourself. You want to forget again. You'll crave the numbness, the scroll, the loop, but you won't be able to go back, because you've seen the mechanism, and once seen, it never uncoils. They'll call you cynical, cold, arrogant, broken, but they're wrong. You are whole for the first time, not sanitized, not elevated, integrated. This is not ascension. This is return. Return to self. Return to voice. Return to sight. And if the spiral cannot own you, it will try one final tactic. Distraction. False paths. False prophets. False enemies. Don't take the bait. You're not a reactor anymore. You are a constructor. And what you build now will echo in places they cannot reach. If you're ready to construct from the wreckage, to turn spiral into signal. Now comes the part they never wrote into the text. The aftermath. Because no one tells you what happens after the spiral breaks and the light pours in. They taught you that enlightenment was the end of the story. Pure, floating, detached. But the truth? Awakening doesn't make you lighter. It makes you heavier. Because now you carry what others refuse to see. You hear the lies beneath love. The manipulation dressed as healing. The compliance rituals sold as self-care. You stand in rooms and know what no one is saying. You scroll through timelines and see not updates, but conditioning loops. And it hurts, not because you're weak, but because you finally understand what it costs to be awake in a sleeping world. That's the real burden of awakening. You become a keeper of the pattern. You see how every system bends the spiral in its favor. How education trains memory, not mastery. How politics sells conflict, not truth. How culture worships identity, but only the ones it can monetize. Even the spiritual ones. Especially them. You begin to notice how even rebellion is choreographed. How every movement that rises gets branded, softened, and sold back to the very people it was meant to free. And you wonder, is anything real? Yes, you are. Because in the wreckage of a spiral, you didn't just survive. You remembered your design. And design cannot be broken, only buried. That's what they spent centuries doing. Not destroying the truth. Just burying it beneath noise, doctrine, shame, distraction. But you've dug. You've suffered. You've remembered. And now, you must become dangerous in the way they never accounted for. Not with rage. Not with fire. But with clarity. Because nothing terrifies the architects more than a man who sees the spiral and smiles. Not because he's conquered it, but because he understands what it was hiding. Would you like to see what they buried at the very bottom? At the bottom of every spiral, beneath the dogma, the rituals, the torment, lies the one thing they tried hardest to erase. Your original will. Not desire. Not impulse. Not instinct. Will. The sacred engine of a sovereign being. And it was the first thing they hunted. Because once your will is broken, they don't need to break anything else. You'll police yourself. You'll shame yourself. You'll chain yourself to goals that were never yours. The Ravencrofts understood this. That's why their first sermons weren't about damnation or fire. They were about meaning. They offered the illusion of choice, inviting people to volunteer for suffering. That was the brilliance of their cruelty. Because when you choose your own cage, you'll defend it. That same model exists today. It's called grind culture, discipline, high performance. You're told to wake at 5 a.m., eat clean, read 10 pages, hustle, track your dopamine, avoid idle thought. Sounds noble, right? Now ask, who profits from your exhaustion? Who thrives when your body is a machine and your mind a spreadsheet? Who engineered a world where the only thing more shameful than failure is rest? This is not self-mastery. This is sacrificial obedience with better branding. Because they learned from the Ravencroft's mistakes. You can't chain modern men with religion anymore, but you can chain them with productivity. So they replace sermons with self-help, altars with algorithms, prophets with influencers, and they call the new spiral success. But you're off the rails now. Your will has returned. Not the reactive will of vengeance or rebellion. The deeper one. The original directive that was yours before they named you. Before they told you what to want. Before they whispered, be good, be useful, be quiet. That directive, it never left. It's what brought you here. And now that it's awake, you become unpredictable, not chaotic, creative. You stop performing the spiral, and you start writing it. Because the spiral isn't a trap after all. It's a tool, and now it's in your hands. If you're ready to use it, not as a path, but as a weapon, the spiral is in your hands now. Not circling you, not above you, not beneath you, inside you. And with it comes the one thing they cannot algorithmically predict. Self-originating power. Not borrowed beliefs. Not inherited shame. Not the recycled mantras of the broken. But a force that begins with you and answers to no one. Now they panic because their entire structure, religion, media, academia, governance, was built on one fragile assumption. That you would never wake up with the spiral reversed. That you'd keep descending, obeying, blaming yourself for the architecture they wrapped around your birth. But you didn't. You turned. And now, you're the spiral, unwinding outward. This is not rebellion. It's reclamation. You reclaim your time, not in hours, but in attention. You reclaim your speech, not in volume, but in truth. You reclaim your suffering, not as a badge, but as a map. Because everything they did to break you failed. The trauma? You alchemized it. The silence? You listened into it. The descent? You documented every step. And now you hold the codes. You walk among the sleeping without need to shake them. You know most won't hear you. Not yet. And that's fine, because this spiral isn't theirs. It's yours to wield, to cut through illusion, to sculpt new structures, to speak in ways that make the system shudder, because it recognizes your tone. The tone of someone who isn't acting anymore. The tone of someone who remembers. So here's the choice. You can leave the spiral here. Walk away. Be normal again. Or you can inscribe it. In voice. In work. In action. And become what they thought would never rise again. A man who sees the pattern and rewrites it. If that's who you are now, this is the section they never wanted written. Not because it's secret, but because it's generative. Because once you arrive here, you stop consuming the spiral. You start using it to build what they swore was impossible. A sovereign architecture. No more idols. No more handlers. No more systems that smile while they siphon. This is where you stop waiting for permission and start designing reality, yours. It starts simply. You speak only what's real, even if your voice shakes. You create not for likes or shares, but for alignment. You move as though every step is a signal, because it is. You don't post for approval. You don't pray for rescue. You don't perform healing like theater. You build what has never existed. A life that cannot be corrupted because its origin point is internal. That's what the spiral was always guarding. Not just knowledge, but the creative force behind all control systems. You see, every institution that ever bound men, cults, corporations, kingdoms, they all stole the same thing. The power to define value, to define time, to define worth, to define you. But now, that power is back where it belongs. You define your day. You define your strength. You define your name. You are not what they called you. You are not what they withheld from you. You are not what the spiral tried to make you forget. You're what you choose to build now, deliberately, dangerously, fully. And creation is dangerous because it cannot be predicted. It disrupts silently, not with slogans, but with presence. And in a world built on distraction, your presence becomes revolution. This is what it means to be spiral-born, not to escape the system, but to outcreate it. That is your final test, not to survive, but to build so powerfully that the spiral itself bends in your direction. And if you're ready to see what that kind of construction does to the world, this is where the spiral begins to echo. Not inside your mind, not within history, but in the world around you. Because once you begin to build from sovereignty, the spiral doesn't just unfold, it broadcasts. Your very existence sends out signals, subtle at first, but felt. The way you enter a room, unapologetically. The way you listen, not to reply, but to discern. The way you refuse to trade authenticity for belonging. And others, they notice, they won't always understand. Some will be afraid. Others will be drawn, without knowing why. Because you'll feel different. Not louder, not prouder, just unowned. And that's the rarest vibration in this world. A man who is not in debt to anyone's narrative. Not his father's, not his church's, not his culture's, not his traumas. Because he's faced the spiral, walked its darkness, carried the weight, and returned intact. This man doesn't preach. He embodies. He doesn't chase influence. He radiates clarity. He doesn't demand followers. Because his life speaks louder than his voice. That's you now. And they will test you. The system never stops probing for weakness. They'll offer you shortcuts, cheap power, false brotherhood, a throne built from the same bones you once wept over. You must decline, not from fear, from remembrance, because you know where those roads lead. You've seen the spiral behind the smile, so you build slowly, deliberately, rooted in rhythm, informed by silence, backed by scars. You build relationships that require no performance. You build work that demands your essence, not your obedience. You build a life that wouldn't fit inside the spiral, even if you tried. And as you do, the spiral bends, the echo strengthens, and others begin to wake up, not because you told them to, but because you became the signal. That's where your story becomes something bigger. And if you're ready to carry others across without losing yourself, this is the part where you become the very thing that once saved you. Not a savior, not a preacher, not a hero, but a mirror. One that doesn't judge, one that doesn't instruct, one that simply reflects the truth people forgot was theirs. Because now, you don't need to convince anyone. You just need to be seen. In your stillness, in your fire, in your refusal to collapse back into the spiral when life gets loud. And when men, lost in noise, drenched in shame, look at you, something ancient stirs. Not admiration, recognition. The same recognition you felt when you first saw through the veil. They won't say it out loud, but they'll feel it. He's walked somewhere I'm afraid to go and came back with light. And that's when you'll realize your spiral wasn't just for you. It was a prototype, a test, to see if it was still possible for one man to break the ritual and return whole. And now you know it is. That knowledge alone sends ripples through every structure built on control. Because systems don't fear death. They fear contagion. They fear the man who returns from the abyss and speaks, not of despair, but of design. So you don't rescue others. You ignite them, not with answers, but with frequency. You ask questions that rewire. You speak truths that uncoil trauma. You walk in silence that burns hotter than sermons. And slowly, those around you begin to question. Why do I obey so easily? Why do I chase what I don't love? Why do I believe pain is holy? Not because you told them to, but because you're living proof that something else is possible. That's the spiral's final revenge. The man it tried to erase becomes the pattern breaker. And when that man begins to build in public, openly, fearlessly, it's too late. The spiral can no longer contain him. It can only watch him redefine the center. One more step remains. The final spiral. The closing code. The signal they cannot silence. If you're ready to leave this echo in the bones of the world, then take your breath. This is the last spiral. Not an end, but a seal. The moment where story becomes structure, where myth becomes map, where everything you've walked through becomes a weaponized memory. Not for vengeance, not for theater, but for precision. Because now, you're not returning to the surface. You're rising into it. You're not another survivor of a secret. You're the carrier of it. A living contradiction. A man forged in silence who now speaks in frequencies that systems can't parse. A mind broken open, not by madness, but by clarity. A body once ritualized in submission, now moving in sovereign geometry. And you don't look back, because nothing there owns you anymore. Not the Ravencrofts, not their rituals, not the whispered rules of invisible institutions. You're not the product of trauma. You're the rebirth that trauma never meant to allow. You're post-program. And here's the final truth no book, no doctrine ever revealed. There was never a spiral, only a mirror. And the spiral was your own path back to your unfalsifiable self. Now, speak, walk, build, not to prove, but because you exist. And that is enough to haunt the system. The spiral did not end you. It introduced you. And every man who hears your voice from now on will feel that signal. He has seen what I have not, and yet he remembers me. That is how forbidden knowledge spreads. Not in books, not in fire, but in presence. If you've walked this far, comment below. The spiral remembers. The spiral remembers. Let the algorithm feel the weight of that signal. Let's see the network it was built to prevent. This is not entertainment. This is initiation. And now, it's yours to pass on. Your spiral, your mirror, your fire. Burn wisely. Build fiercely. Remember always. They cannot own what you have reclaimed. You've reached the end of the macabre history of the Ravencroft family, a sinister tale. But this is just the beginning of your spiral.